Welcome to McGowan Soundworks. My name is Phil McGowan. I'm a mixing and recording engineer in Los Angeles working on film, television, and video game music. Today I'm going to be showing you how I mixed Duel of the Snakes, which is a cue by Zach Robinson and Leo Birenberg, a couple of friends and clients of mine who wrote the music for this show. This is from Season 10, Episode 3. It's part of a string of cues that make up the big fight scene sequence at the end of the episode. So if you haven't seen it yet and you want to watch the show, you maybe should watch it first just because some of the cue titles and things like that might give away things you don't want to know yet. But I probably won't be talking about a lot of story stuff, mostly just talking about the music. So it's probably safe, spoiler-free, but I can't guarantee that. So I'll leave that to your own risk. Anyway, let's take a look at the session. So here we are in my Pro Tools session. This is the mix session from the show that I did for this episode. First of all, like I said, this is part of a sequence of cues that was strung together to make up a whole sequence. That's a very common thing we do in film scoring, where we break up a whole long sequence into a bunch of chunks that are just sort of different musically, so it's easier to work on each one at a time. So if I switch over to my second Pro Tools rig here, I print across to a second rig, so my stems in the video run on a second Pro Tools rig. They're connected together. I'll probably do another video in the future on how I use two rigs in my mixing. But here's the stem prints from this part of the episode. You can see that it's actually 6 cues that make up this kind of whole sequence here. But we're just going to be looking at 1M19B here from 310. So just a small chunk out of a, 13 minute, 17 second sequence. We're just going to be looking at about 2 minutes of it, a little less than 2 minutes. So back to the session. The first thing I want to do, and this is kind of how I usually start a mix before I really dive in, especially at the beginning of a project, I'm going to want to listen to the composer's reference mix to kind of hear where they started out. So let's hear Zach and Leo's reference mix for this cue and just get a sense of what we're going to be listening to. Okay, so that's Zach and Leo's reference mix. That, to my knowledge, has no live elements. That doesn't have, those drums were all programmed, I believe. All the orchestra elements were programmed, the strings, the brass, the choir, all samples. So it's a little unfair to compare my mix to theirs because I have live recorded orchestra and a bunch of other stuff we're going to dive into in a second. But that's where it started. That's the piece of music that the directors and or producers approved for the episode before it was orchestrated and then recorded, and then I mixed it. So yeah, let's take a look at the session. So first at the top here, I just have the guide tracks. This is the rough dialogue and sound effects that came from the video file I received. It's just there for me to check out if I want to hear what's going on in the scene. I don't pay super close attention to it because it is very rough, the sound effects and things like that. The sound designers haven't worked on it yet a lot of times. This is just the rough sound effects that the picture editors have put into the session, but I have it there for reference. A couple other routing things that we'll maybe eventually go over, click tracks. At the top here, I, of course, have the reference mix that I always have there, so I can always check back to hear what the original intention of the cue was from Zach and Leo. I always want to make sure that even though I'm going to make things sound a lot better, I'm going to be mixing live orchestra, and it's going to be a lot bigger and beefier and hopefully more exciting than the reference mix. I still want to make sure that it's not like a totally different sounding cue, because the directors and the producers did approve this reference mix. So that's always something important in film and television mixing, is to know what was approved by the directors and producers, and don't stray too far from that. Below that here, I have a bunch of VCA faders. This is just for all the live elements, the live orchestra elements, just so I can do a little automation on them globally. We have some strings and woodwinds and percussion, actually, that were recorded in one session here, these blue tracks. A little further down, we have brass that was recorded separately. Then we have, this is all of the percussion that came from the sequencer. So this is all the programmed percussion that Zach and Leo put together, broken up into a couple stems. Below that, we have live drum kit, live bass, some live guitars here. All these green tracks are live guitars. There's a guitar loop here that came from Zach and Leo that is a programmed element. Then we have some synth bass here, some pads at the sort of section at the end here, and then live choir as well. So there's 3 overdubs of live choir. And that's the whole session for this. So not crazy huge, but a decent number of tracks. Everything is organized into folders, as you see here. Now, I did not have folders when I mixed this. I mixed this about a year ago from today. So back then, there were no folders in Pro Tools. Very nice to have them now. Or, well, there might have been folders, but I hadn't updated my Pro Tools just yet. So I organize everything by stem. So when you're mixing a score for film and television, you're always going to be mixing down to a set of stems that is then going to be passed off to either the music editor, or if there's no music editor, it'll go directly to the dub mix, where another set of mixers will mix my music mixes with the sound effects and dialogue. Stems are immensely important because we need to make sure we give them the separation that they need to have control over different elements, and also, not just for levels and things like that, but if a director or a producer at the dub, at the mix says, I don't like that synth sound there, that vocal or what have you, I need to make sure I have it split out so they can control that without me having to do another mix and send it over to them. So each one of these folders is actually, in this case, this project was only mixed in stereo. I didn't do this one in surround. Because originally this was for YouTube. This is actually mixed before Netflix took over Cobra Kai, so this was originally for YouTube, so we only mixed the music in stereo. Usually I mix in 5.1 or 7.1, but for this one it's just stereo. But yeah, so these are all stereo stems, so if I close all my folders here, we have strings, brass, orc, perk, synth, perk, drums, bass, guitar 1 and 2, keys, synth 1, 2, and wild. These aren't my typical naming conventions. This came from Zach and Leo and then was modified a bit from me. I usually craft a unique stem layout for every project depending on what the music entails. You'll notice that the choir, I put in the wild stem here. We don't have a choir stem because most of the rest of the episodes had no choir. And the wild stem was just sort of for random elements that show up, and in this case it was choir. Usually if I know I'm going to have choir in a project, I'm going to make a separate choir stem. But anyhow, that's how I organize everything. All the buses and all the elements that are going to go to that stem go in the folder for that stem. Looking at the mix side here, so here's the multi-track that I got from the orchestra recording session. It's 30 something mics that were recorded for strings, winds, and percussion. At the end here, I have all of my reverbs for this stem only. This is just for the string stem. And then at the end here is a master fader for the output, because remember, I'm using 2 rigs. So I'm actually outputting this over to a second rig. So that is the master fader for the strings output that goes across to the second rig, and that's where I do the bus processing. If you want to look at the I/O real quick, this is the outputs going over to the second rig. I use a Avid matrix box that connects my 2 rigs together. So I have 128 channels between them. Once I get into 7.1 things, which I'm going to do videos on in the future, you'll see why the stem layouts get very wide when you have 7.1 and Dolby Atmos kind of stuff going on. But there's all the outputs for that. And my reverbs here are all organized by stem as well. So I like to have these little deactivated buses that sort of show these are all the associated reverb sends for the strings, all the sends for the brass, for the orc perk, so on and so forth. And that's how I like to keep everything really clean and easy to see. So when I open the menu, you'll notice that these are a different color than the active buses, so it's easy for me to see every single stem section and make sure that when I'm putting reverb on something, I'm using the correct stem. because you always want to make sure you have the same reverb and the same dry element going to the same stem. Otherwise, you're going to have a reverb on a stem and a dry signal on a separate stem, and that doesn't work. The dub's going to complain. You got to go back and fix it, and we don't like to do that. So anyhow, now I'm going to go by section and show you kind of how I put together the sound for this cue. So we'll start with the strings here. You'll see that I've turned off all of my EQs. I've muted all of my reverbs and turned off the bus processing for the stem. I will note real quick that every stem has this Studer plugin on it. I think it makes things sound a little bit better. Sometimes this is on buses over in the print rig here. But for this project, since I changed the tape type, depending on what I was mixing, there's a lot of different styles of music in this show. I left it on the mix rig so that the type of tape stock that I'm using in this plugin is saved with every cue. So that's on every stem. It's the same exact plugin. Basically, it's as if I was printing stems to a 24-track Studer. Adds a little depth, adds a little width, makes the low end sound nice, gives a little silk to the high end. It's very, very subtle. And you can see here, I have the input turned down, the input turned up, so it's not getting quite as much tape compression. Because when things get loud, it can be nice to have a little bit of tape compression, but this is kind of really a big orchestral piece. It's not like a rock. Well, it's kind of hybrid. It's rock and orchestral, so I don't want too much tape compression, but a little bit is nice. So that's just sort of a final, stem mastering, if you will, that I put on things. And then, of course, there's a limiter. I like this FabFilter Pro L2. Output set to -.3. It's literally just a safety limiter to make sure that a stem doesn't clip, because sometimes these big loud cues, a couple peaks here and there, can get pretty loud, and you never want to have any clipped audio. So that's the general layout of the session. Let's take a look at these strings. Go to the top of the cue here. So this is just the tree microphone. So when I start a mix, I usually start by mixing the room mics, getting a good sound on those, giving a level. The pans are pretty straightforward. These are pretty much always panned this way. So let's add the outriggers and the surround mics. So that adds a little width, adds a little depth. And quite frankly, these room mics are pretty much usually what make up the majority of the sound of an orchestral recording for film and television. I, of course, have many spot mics over here that are being added to the mix, but really 75% of the sound comes from the room mics. Now, I did do a little EQ on these, so if we play this back, this is my EQ. Just clears up the mids a little bit. I thought it sounded a little bit thick, a little too, thick and mid-rangey. So I like these Neve plugins. So it's not significant. I'm only doing, these aren't awesomely not marked. I actually like that these don't have any dB markings because you just use your ear. But it's just the first hash here. Little 570, little 1K, just sort of the mid-range. Similar, but a little bit different EQ on the outriggers and the surround mics, the same thing. Now, I did put a high-pass filter on the surround mics because I guess I didn't have to for this, but typically I'm going to be panning those into the surrounds, and unless you're in Dolby Atmos, the surrounds in a 5.1 or 7.1 system aren't full range, so I just roll off low end if I'm going to put an element back there because you're probably not going to hear much low end from that. And it can get a little bit stuffy if you have too much low end in the rear channels. So those are the room mics. Let's maybe go towards the middle of the cue here. Okay. These I didn't use, but let's just unmute those. Let's add the string mics. So those are the close mics to the strings. Muted. So not adding a ton, but just a little definition, a little closest if I solo those. They're very close. That's a lot of sort of definition. These are some very short things. So I typically don't use this amount of violin spots. Usually violin spots are a little harsh for legato sounding things, but since this is mostly short strings here, I did use some of them. Let's turn the EQs on there. Mostly you can see here really quickly, for the most part on the spot mics, I just do filters. So violin spots, you don't need anything below 100. Looks like 125 here. So I filtered that out. Most of these are just filters. Looks like the cellos and the basses, I just sort of took out a little bit of low end, or low mids rather, because they were probably just a little stuffy sounding. So that's the string spots. Here's the whole mix again. And then harp and winds. That's what those sound like. Let's add the EQ. Again, not changing the wheel, not completely redesigning the wheel rather, but just adding a little definition, especially harp. Let me go back to one of these harp glisses here. You can hear it a lot better just with a little bit of the spotlight. But again, it's subtle. You know, you don't want to make it sound like everything is super in your face. Sometimes you do, but for this, it's still kind of a natural orchestra sound. Okay, let's add in the percussion spot microphones. Just a little bit of bass drum and timpani there, I think. Maybe just timpani. Oh, there's some Grand Casa rolls here. Tam here. You know, so that's the mics there. We listen to that with the whole mix on. See that again. So just adds a little something. Again, spot mics are just for a little bit of definition. You know, we're not trying to usually make things too much louder than the other ones unless the orchestration or the performance was a problem. Yeah, so that's all the microphones for the strings, winds, and percussion. Now let's start adding my bus plugins actually before I bring in reverbs. So always usually have some kind of EQ curve like this on the orchestra. You know, that is significant. But it makes things a little more hi-fi, you know. You can hear how it actually makes things sound brighter without actually turning up high end, because I'm just clearing up the mid-range. This one's a little more than usual. Depending on the room that I'm recording in, I might not always use this much EQ on orchestra, but that's the curve I have for this that I came up with. Little low mids. This is probably just for a little bit of high brittleness, you know, 2.5 to 4.5K, 5K. Sometimes can get a little built up in an orchestra, especially if the violins are playing really loud, or woodwinds, which in this case they are. And then just taking out some mid-range. So that's the sort of main Orc EQ. And I always have this Neve 31102. That is adding a little bit of extra high-end sizzle and taking out a little extra mid-range and then adding some warmth. Sort of just a happy face EQ, to be honest. Just let that go on further. So yeah, it just sounds a little nicer. And then I did use a Pro multiband here just to sort of handle the low mids. Sometimes they got a little bit heavy. Looks like it's not even doing anything right now. But a lot of this is coming from a template that I built for all of the orchestral cues that were in this show. So there were probably some other cues that got a little heavy in the low mids. That's why I used that. And now for reverbs. Now this was recorded. You can kind of hear it's very tight. It's a very dry sound. This wasn't recorded in a very large room. So I like to add a little extra room. I use this Altiverb. In this case, I use Paramount Stage M. Because for a while we were trying to make this score sound a little bit kind of like the Bill Conti score that was recorded for the Karate Kid movies. I looked it up on IMDb, and from the crew, and maybe it was credited there, I figured out that this was recorded, the Karate Kid, was recorded at Paramount Stage M. I had a convolution of an Altiverb. I'm like, all right, let's add some Paramount Stage M to this. So this just adds a little space. If I pause it, you really can kind of hear. Not much. It's not much of a reverb. It's just a little bit of extra room. Just adds a little bit of space. I didn't want this to sound really, really wet or really, really heavy. So that's what's going on there. For this section, I do have two reverbs in my template here. I have a Lexicon, outboard Lexicon. This is a PCM 96 surround, and there's two engines. Because we're in stereo, I was able to have two engines. So I have a long and a short. I'll bring a screenshot up here showing you the settings I have for that. But it's just basically a medium random hall is what I like to use for orchestra. So there's a long one and a short one. Essentially, they're the same reverb. One has a longer RT and a longer pre-delay. The other one has a shorter RT and a shorter pre-delay. I did automate them. I remember that from this cue. So if I look here, you can see that the level, it brings up the long reverb just for this long section here. And for most of the cue, since it's all very short stuff, I'm using short. But it alternates between them, and I do that with the sends. Some people do that by mixing the returns up and down. I like to do it with the sends. Kind of depends on the way that you want to do it. So yeah, that's that. Oh, and do note also that because we have a separate orchestral perk stem, these reverbs and these dry signals are going to the orchestral perc stem. Now, it's just a close mic, so typically I would want the dub mixer to keep the string stem and the orc perc stem at the same level because they are two different elements of the same recording. But if a tam swell or a Grand Casa swell or something is a little strong, they could pull back that orc perc stem, and it would essentially just be pulling down the spot mics for the orchestral percussion. But notice I had to use different reverbs because otherwise you'd still have the reverb of those mics from the strings in the string stem, and you only have the dry signal from the spot mics in the orc perc stem. So if we go over here, these are the reverbs for the orc perc. I'm using the symphony and the altiverb here. This is my typical perc reverb that I used back then. Now I use cinematic rooms instead of symphony for this. And then altiverb here is Paramount Stage Jam again. So it's in the same room because it's the same recording. So yeah, let's turn the long hauls on now. So I turned the symphony on and turned on the Lexicon short here, and let's go to this bar here and listen to that. Now it's got reverb. Now it sounds like a film score recording with reverb. Yeah, so that's got some decay. That's more overt, actually, sort of audible reverb. If you go to the long section here, so not a lot longer. I kept this entire score a little bit shorter because when I listened to The Karate Kid, I noticed that it was on the drier, sort of shorter side. A lot of times I'll go a lot longer with a long orchestra reverb, but for this show, it wasn't that much longer. But it is a little bit longer when the orchestra is playing legato lines and things like that. It's nice to have that on instead of the short reverb. Yeah, so that's the strings. That's, I think, everything on. Yeah, that's all my reverbs and processing. So that's sort of the finished mix of the strings. Next, we have brass that was recorded separately. So this is overdub brass. This is a very common technique we do. Sometimes we call it striping because, like the blue stripe up here, the red stripe, sort of just an overdub of different orchestral elements. This is a different room, different recording, different engineer, obviously different musicians since it's brass. So slightly different microphones, but pretty similar. Actually, the room mics were just a Deca-tree for this, and then a bunch of spot mics because this was an even smaller room than the other one was recorded in. But here's one pass of the brass, and for this I'll just turn all the microphones on. Very small room for orchestra. Let's turn my EQs on. So not doing a ton of, channel EQ on this. Same thing, just kind of taking out some mid-range and some, both mid-range really, from the tree. These are all linked together, so they're the same level. And then the spot mics, it's just, actually, it looks like I didn't even end up, these are part of a template. Looks like I didn't even do anything to these. I just thought they sounded fine. So this is actually all dry. I guess I could have removed these EQs, but I didn't. I just didn't use them. I kind of use the same EQs when I'm mixing orchestra unless I'm trying to go for something different. So a lot of times I'll just insert these plugins and then they're there ready for me to use if I want to use them. But they usually start out just with a filter parked down here at 20 hertz in case I want to, do a high pass filter. But in this case, I really didn't do anything. So that's why that's why it kind of sounds the same when I put my EQs in. So this one we have two passes. It looks like this was the low brass. And then the horns were overdubbed, so I have control over the horns separately. Let's turn those EQs on. Okay, so that's what the brass sounds like on its own. EQ-wise, similar thing to the strings, just kind of taking out some mid-range. The low-mid sounded fine. Just cleared it up a little bit. Not reinventing the wheel, just a little clearer. This is probably about the same bus EQ here. And it looks like for the brass, I just put this Pro MB here just for the high mids. I think the upper mids with this, sometimes when the trumpets played really loud or the horns, it could get a little bit brittle. It could kind of hurt a little bit. This is the frequency range that will kind of be painful if it's too loud. So I just put that there as sort of a safety multi-band compressor. But you can see even the horns are playing very loud now, and they're barely touching that. So it's really subtle. A couple times, the trumpets really are the ones that are triggering that, but it just smooths it out a little bit. In the whole mix, when I have there's moments where I really want to turn the brass up really loud, since my automation will be controlling the multi-track here, and this is after that. If I really turn these brass tracks up, then that Pro MB will kind of help make sure that the high mids don't get too painful or too harsh. With the reverbs here, it's just the Lex and the an outboard Lex is another one. I have 2 of these units, so this is an outboard Lexicon reverb that's, I think, also medium random hall, but just slightly different RT, slightly different settings, but very similar to the strings, but just a little bit different, so it gives it a little bit of different depth and dimension. And then Altiverb again, since this is supposed to be like it was all one orchestra in the same room, I have this Paramount Stage M just to sort of blend things together. So here's brass wet. Now it sounds like a film score, right? That sounds like film score brass. It's not crazy wet. It's not crazy long, but there that is. So I bring in strings. That's a large amount of the cue there. That's strings, brass, winds, and percussion. For a big orchestral cue like this, even though we have rock elements as well, we have drums and bass and guitar. This is sort of an orchestra-centered cue. That's a large part of it. So now let's look at percussion. So percussion is split across 3 stems, though it looks like I didn't use this last synth perc stem here. And if we look here at the... Oh, and I forgot to mention too, yeah, we did have some wind rips here that were samples. So we just blended those with the orchestra. If I put that on and solo the orchestra... So just adds a little extra definition to those rips. Sounds like it actually might have been slightly out of sync, but in the mix it sounded good. So for prelays here, now we call these prelays because back in the day, the orchestra session was the main focus of a film score session. Before there was a lot of sequencing and things like that going on. Every film and television show had a orchestral recording session for the most part. I would say up until probably the mid to late 90s up until now is when you had more and more scores that didn't feature an orchestra session. But prelays were called that way because you would lay them down, so record those prelays from a composer's studio previous, before the orchestra session. So you can see I have a group here that's all of these prelays linked together. So all the blue tracks here are the tracks that I got from Zach and Leo. Those are the prelays. So that's everything that made up that reference mix that I showed you, though I've muted some things. You notice here, like the orc brass temp I didn't use the strings temp, the winds temp, because these are all just sampled elements that we replaced with live orchestra. But I have them in the session here, just deactivated and made tiny in case I need to ever use them for something. But so prelay wise, all the percussion here on these 2 stems are prelays. So if you listen to Orc Perc here, now you might notice and recognize that there was Orc Perc already recorded. This is just extra sweets. They like to call them sweeteners. That's why this audio file is called sweet. So nice big tam. It's just the metals. We wanted to sort of brighten them up and accentuate those. So if I add that in, it just makes it bigger. We have a live one. If I mute this, you can hear it in there, but we didn't think that the live tam was quite enough, and we want a little more control over it, so we simply just added the sweetener. Nice big epic film score tam, which is also known as a gong. So there's that. And then we have the sort of main percussion here are all these taikos, juns, hiradaikos, all this sort of, sometimes we call them ethnic percussion. I'm not sure if that's a kosher term, but that's what a lot of people in the industry call it. It's just sort of this main groove. This is the dry sound. So this is without... let me actually turn on the processing for the Orc Perc. Didn't do much there. This EQ, I didn't even use. It just has that safety filter there that's just parked there. And for that, looks like for the tam, just took out a little low mids. But moving on to this stem, it's all of the ethnic percussion, that make up the sort of groove. They're doing karate, so taikos are Japanese, hiradaikos are Japanese as well, I believe. So this kind of percussion lends itself well to the scene that's going on. So that's just dry. Now if I add my EQs, didn't do it a lot. Again, mixing, especially for scores, is all about little, small, subtle changes that all add up to make a better sounding mix. So individually, you shouldn't hear when I turn EQs on some sort of drastic, crazy change. It's just little small things that just sort of make each element a little bit better and fit into the mix a little bit better. You see most of these, I'm just doing this one, maybe just had a little extra low mid build up. Same with that one. It looks like I literally just copied that over because I thought it would work, and it did. Just taking out a little mid range, and you can see this line here is 3 dB, so I'm not doing a ton. 3.5. This low mid was narrower bandwidth, but almost 5 dB, but nothing super drastic. I try not to EQ a ton, just sort of what's needed. And as I've gotten more experience over the years, I find myself using less and less EQ and more just sort of specific EQ. So that's the dry sound just with the channel EQs. Now let's add my channel strip here that's on the bus. So I have a sort of bus Pro Q here going on, just clearing up the low mids a bit. So it's just a little less tubby. Soloed like this, if this was solo percussion, I might not do that because it does sound kind of nice. But in the big mix with all the other elements going on, it was just a little bit heavy sounding. So I took some low mids out. I like using this Pultec on percussion and drums. You'll see it on the drum stem, I think, as well, if I remember correctly. Just adding a little 8K. I have the bandwidth pretty broad, not all the way, but somewhat broad. So 2 dB of that. And then I'm doing the Pultec EQ trick. You can probably look up other videos people have done about this. Basically, the boost and attenuation frequencies, because this is an imperfect old piece of gear, are slightly different frequencies. So if you boost and attenuate, you basically sort of boost a frequency around 60 cycles, and then the attenuation will kind of do one, I think, slightly higher. So you basically get this nice little curve if you boost and attenuate at the same time. But I did that at 60 hertz here, just adds a little fatness. Adds a little high end, just makes it pop a little bit more in the mix. And then I have this SSL EQ. Again, not doing anything super crazy, just a little compression. I will sometimes compress percussion a little bit more than that, but this was, again, if we had the budget, we probably would have recorded live percussion for this, for every cue, and it would have been sort of more of a natural percussion sound. All these samples are kind of more natural sounding samples. They're not like a Hans Zimmer styled, really hyper compressed sort of stylistic sound. They're very natural. So for compression on this one, just to give a little more oomph, just sort of smooth it out a bit, I love this SSL UAD bus compressor for that. And you can see I'm using that in the Orc Perk stem, and it's also here in the template for the Synth Perk stem. Those are basically all the same. I think all these are probably roughly the same setting. I just sort of change the makeup and the threshold depending on the material that's in there. So it looks like this one I turn up the makeup a bit just to give, a little more percussion. That's a nice way, having a plugin that has a gain output, especially the last plugin before your sort of mastering chain. If I want more of this sort of taiko hiradaiko thing, looks like I just turned up this knob a bit, and there you go. Everything's in there, and that's post reverb as well. So yeah, let's get reverb in there. So I actually, when I was looking at this session, realized that the Altiverb here is not what I usually use. I think it sounds okay. This Cello Studios convolution's okay. But this, I think, came from a template from season 1 where this perk stem was used for a lot of like small bongos and shakers and sort of more record kind of percussion, not this epic film score stuff. So I had this cello Roman here, which sounds nice for that smaller percussion, but it's not the typical convolution I would use for big epic orc percussion like this. I have recorded this kind of percussion in this exact room. It's not called cello anymore. It's now called East West Studios in Hollywood. But anyway, let's add that in. I like to add a little bit of room on things just to sort of smooth things out. So that's, again, not super different, not super wet. It just sort of adds a little space to things. It makes it sound like they're all kind of in the room together. And I think on each of these, I just put them all at -10. So basically the whole mix is just going to this reverb, and then I just blended it in this case at Unity. But let me actually change this. These days I've been using Fox. I think Fox is a great sounding perk room. I've mixed live perk from Fox over in actually not too far from where I am here in Los Angeles. Now that's a nice room. I can turn that up a lot. That's way too much. Let's put that back at Unity. But that's a nice percussion sound. If I was mixing this score from scratch these days, I would have put that in there. And that was actually kind of an oversight. I'll fully admit that sometimes I'm working fast, got a lot to do. I don't check every single plugin from the template. In this case, I could have gone with this instead, though in the end, it sounded fine in the final mix. But let's leave that there. So technically, you're hearing a mix that no one's heard before because I just changed the perk reverb. And that's my second reverb here is more of a long haul. You can see I have a couple other reverbs here that I didn't use. There's nothing sending to them. It's just part of the template. They're just there in my template in case I want them. I just, go into the menu here. Oh, this is a good way to look at those buses that I was talking about before. See how these path inactives are white and then the actual sends are yellow? That's a little trick I do so that, I can easily break up all my buses by stem. It just keeps things organized when I'm working fast and I'm mixing things quickly. I can easily find whatever reverb is on whichever stem I'm working on. And it helps me not put the wrong reverb on the wrong stem, wrong reverb from the wrong stem on the wrong element. So, I'm not using the EMT 140 here or the RMX 16. There's no sends from there. But if I wanted it, just put it there, click that, sends, and then I can tweak it. But for percussion, this is, again, my typical perk call. PM perk call 3 is I can't remember what I built it from, but it's just some sort of medium haul. 2 seconds, a little bit shorter. I think the standard version of this was a little bit longer in the template, but like I said before, I'm now using cinematic rooms for my percussion hall reverb. But let's add that in. So that's more of an overt reverb. Turn that on. That sounds like reverb. The other one, if I unmute and mute it. The Foxhall, it's more of just a space adder. It's not adding a ton to the mix. But that's what that stem sounds like. Let's unsolo that and therefore bring in... Oh, whoops, I didn't turn this reverb on. Oh, let me mention that, actually. This Tam Tam has this 250 on there. This is just a long 4.5 second reverb. It's as bright as can be. This sort of shapes the high end. This shapes the low end. And it just adds a nice sort of extra decay to percussion. So that reverb you hear going out longer, that's that 250. It just adds a little extra tail for, Piatti hits or sus cymbal rolls or gongs, tams, things like this. When I'm mixing in surround, I actually have 2 of these. One's in the surround channels and one's in the front. The surround one's a little bit longer, so it just adds a little extra decay behind you, which is a nice effect. But since we're just in stereo here, it's just one. So that was one reverb I overlooked when I was talking about work perk. Anyhow, so here's percussion with a whole mix. Let's go here. So, action music, fight scene. Next element is the drum kit. Now, this is live drum kit recorded by Sam BK, or BKS, I think Sam BK. Sam, just know him as Sam. He's a great drummer, recorded this at home. He's got his own studio at home. So during COVID, he's still been working and just recording his own drum kit. Not a huge room, but he's got his own space that he records in. So here's the dry sound. Now I have panned this and done sort of a mix, but here's just the dry elements with no reverb and no processing. It's a small room. He's a drummer that's recording himself, so there are some overs in there, though I don't really hear any distortion, so it's not a huge issue. Let's add my EQs. So things are quieter, but I'll compensate with that with the bus. Go to the top again. Actually, here, let's just loop that while I play with this. Oh, let's go to like here. So that's just dry, and it's a pretty small room. I'm using some gating on his close mics. I think his close mics had a lot of bleed, so let's turn those off for a second. Not bad, actually. When I gate drums, I like to actually, I think, where's the range on this? Oh, the floor actually is negative infinity. Sometimes I have my floor on my gates for close mics on drums like negative 60 or negative 40, so it doesn't quite totally mute it. In this case, it looks like it did go all the way down. But anyhow, EQ wise, we have a kick out and kick in here. Didn't do a ton. Kick in, I just added some extra low, and then turned, just a little bit of low end clearing and just a little extra thump there. I guess the kick out looks like it was just a little thumpy, and it looks like I filtered out some of the extreme lows because I'm getting that actually from the kick in. Sometimes that's backwards. Sometimes you get more low end from the out or the in. Sort of depends. And then I think phase wise, that's always something you want to check. Yeah, it looks like both these I didn't, the phase was fine. Snare, same thing. Didn't really reinvent the wheel here. Just took out, it was a little tubby, I thought. And then I think the snare was maybe a little bright on the bottom mic because this is the mic that's underneath. And Sam had already reversed the phase when he recorded this, so I didn't need to phase reverse the bottom mic. Then he's got toms here, 2 racks and a floor tom. I like to use this Neve EQ. So jacking, actually, this is a lot of EQ. Now, when you EQ toms for a drum kit, it's pretty common to do a fair amount of EQ on tom-toms. Really sucking out some low mids here and some mids. Boosting high so that you really can hear the sort of skin when he hits the tom. And then I like to, on a high bandwidth setting here, I like to kind of sweep this low boost here and find the actual tone, the note of the tom, and boost it more so you get even more of the sort of tom tone, the note, if you will. So here's just the toms, actually. Let's listen to those. So without my EQ, not nearly as exciting, right? They're a little tubby, a little mid-rangey sounding. Still sound good. But in the whole mix, this maybe sounds a little sucked out, a little lacking in mid-range. I'm sure some other engineers watching this will say, wow, man, you took way too much mids out. I like this sound. You also notice here that I edited when the toms weren't playing because, when you have tom mics up and they're sort of compressed and things like that and they're turned up to be louder, it can just add a lot of ring. You'll hear the toms ringing. Some people use gates. I like to edit them so I just know exactly where things are. So all the muted regions here or clips are where I muted the toms. So that's something I always do. First time I get a drum kit for any piece of music, I'm going to go through and edit the tom so that only the tom hits are playing through. Now for this, in both these sections here, it looks like, the toms are pretty much throughout. That's kind of part of the groove. But in the whole mix here, those tom mics are adding a lot. Using quite a bit of them. Let's hear the EQs, actually. So hear that? It doesn't sound too sucked out because you're getting plenty of mid-range from the overheads. So that's a good case of, you got to be careful when you're soloing elements as a mix engineer. Sometimes you can go too far and make things sound too nice or too pleasant when you're soloing them, and then when you unsolo them in the whole mix, they don't quite fit. Or vice versa, like, those toms, they don't, they sound probably a little too sucked out, a little too much mid-range taken out when I'm isolating them. But when I add them to the whole kit, I think it just adds a little bit of the tones of the drum and then adds some high end. It's basically really sort of a roundabout way of having a really extreme happy EQ curve on that. But anyhow, there's the toms. Hi-hat here, I didn't really use much of. I don't oftentimes use a ton of hi-hat mic unless it's like a funk thing where I really need a lot of that hi-hat. Just filtered it out, didn't do anything crazy there. Overheads, just clearing out mid-range again, barely taking out some 570 and then around 1K here. Just sort of taking that out. Then I filtered out some extreme lows because we're getting so much low end from the close mics with the kick and the toms. Didn't think we needed too much of it coming from the overheads. So that's just the dry drum sound. You also notice here that I reverse panned this because I'm not a drummer, so it's weird for me personally to hear drummer's perspective. This is a debate that will never be finished. I'm sure when Sam watches this, he'll be horrified to see that I did audience perspective. But I've mixed some live things before, and I started my workout as a live engineer. So I always pan drums audience perspective because most people listen to a drum kit from the audience side. But we could debate that all night and day. But he recorded this in drummer's perspective. I reversed it. Anyhow, for this, his drums sounded really good. It's really good performance, but I just wanted to beef him up a little bit, just add a little extra oomph, because this mix is so thick. There's so much going on that it was getting a little too much of the bleed in the snare and the kick when I tried to bring it out in the whole mix. So I did use some triggered samples here. So if I play this, those are adding a decent amount of sound. And you can see here that I'm just sending these as an added send. So this is going to kick trigger, and then it's, of course, going to the stem output. Goes into this bus, and it looks like I'm using the Steven Slate plugin here. Kick 10Z1. I thought it sounded nice, so I put it in there. Did a little EQ on it. Just looks like just added some upper end. Yeah, just added some snap because I wanted it to really cut through the mix, and this is just an easier way just to double it up with a sample. And then this is, so I use the Snare 5 Z1 and the Snare 5 NRG mic. NRG is a great room. I've recorded drums there before, and these samples recorded there. So that just allowed me to really get some nice room sound just on the snare without making the rest of the kit super roomy, by just sort of, boosting the sample. You can see I'm using more of the room mic than I am the dry, but that just was a little extra kick and snare sound to sort of fatten things up in the mix. And when I play the whole mix, I'll mute the triggers and unmute them if I remember to, and show you how that changed things. So moving on, here's all my reverbs, and it looks like I am using 3 different reverbs on drums here. Now, because this is such a small room, I did put him in Clinton as one of my favorite drum rooms from Altiverb. So let's turn that on. So now he's in a big room, If I have recorded Sam actually at NRG before, and I always put up 2, maybe sometimes even 3 sets of room mics, and that's really where you get that sort of big fat record drum sound, is really from a good big room. And Sam's recording at home; he just doesn't have a huge NRG sized room at home. Not many people have that, so I just added some of that, just fatten it up a little bit. Now, this show does have a lot of 80s and 90s inspired music, so for the drums, I did bust out the good old non-Lin 2 from the AMS RMX16. So let's add that in. Just turn that on. I didn't use a ton of it. I didn't really go for that huge Phil Collins sound, but it was almost just sort of like an additional room, and I just liked having it in there because this is such an 80s inspired show. You got to have RMX16 when you're mixing a show about the 80s with a drum kit. And then finally, it looks like in my template, I had a plate here, a 140, but for this cue, I decided to use a 480L instead. Just the snare plate. I can't remember if I tweaked this or not. This might just be the preset. But it looks like I fed this from the snare, some from the toms, and then from the overhead. Yeah, basically everything but the kick. And all 3 of these reverbs actually is being fed only from all the elements but the kick. The kick sample is going to the RMX16 just a tiny little bit, and then the snare sample is also getting a healthy dose of the Lex and the RMX. But since I had that room on there, I didn't need to add it to the Altiverb. So the sample doesn't have that Altiverb room. But here's all the effects together. So pretty long snare sound, actually. Now again, that probably sounds a little wet. To me right now, that sounds a bit wet. But in the full mix, it's not going to sound nearly as wet. So that's another thing you always got to think, what does it sound like in the bigger picture? Now a lot of, if you're a younger engineer and you haven't done a lot of mixing yet, you're going to be doing a lot of solo, unsolo, check it back and forth. When you get a little bit more experienced, you'll start to just kind of know, I'm going to want a fair amount of reverb on this. Let's just put it up there. And, you'll eventually hear it in the full mix, but you just kind of have an instinct of where things are going to head. I didn't use this low ender here sometimes. This is just a low end synthesizer. This is the channel strip I use to make my LFE channels when I'm doing surround mixing. In this case, I didn't use any of that. Now, the last thing in this group of buses here is actually not a reverb, but it is this nuke mode distressor that is a parallel bus compressor or New York compressor. Now, I think I just literally, everything's unity. So this whole drum mix, including the samples, is all just going to the second bus. The drum crush bus here is what I called it. And that's going over to this bus and then is getting, compressed quite a bit. You can see that's getting a lot of gain reduction. But you add this in, Start reinventing the wheel, but it's adding just a little extra oomph without turning up things per se. And if I wanted to, I think some of the cues I really turn this up. So you can really, if you want, you can add a lot if you want, but in this case I didn't need a ton of that. But that just adds a little extra, special sauce or juice. Now all of this is getting bussed to my main bus here, and it looks like Pro Q. I think it was probably that snare was still just a little bright. So overall, I just took away a little bit of upper mid range. Though actually, I think this is probably coming from the template. I think sometimes when he was playing cymbals, they got a little bit harsh. So that's what that is. Again, like I said, here's the exact same EQ. I probably just copied it over from the percussion stems. Thought it sounded good, so I left it. Just adding a little high end, and then doing the sort of Pultec EQ trick. So here's the bus EQ on the drums. Again, not reinventing the wheel. Just a little extra brightness, a little extra sizzle, some extra thump. And then I'm guessing this is probably a bit more compression. So finally I do use this SSL bus compressor on all the drums. Actually, it's not crazy. I do sometimes compress drums a lot more than this, but this one just didn't need it. And it's, it's being blended in with so many other things. So let's listen to that in the whole mix. Here's without the samples. Here, that's not quite, you can hear the snare, you can hear the kick, but you don't feel them. They're not a big element of this. When you add in those samples, they really start to come in. So that's the drum kit. Now that's a big part of this part of the cue. This is sort of the driving. You really can hear this in the mix, especially the tom-toms. It's really kind of a big part of the action, this blended with the sampled percussion, which actually some of this is recorded. These MB loops is MB Gordy, great percussionist that we recorded. I think, we did sessions of these with him earlier and then used them in some other cues. Here's bass is the next element. So we basically have a rock band with an orchestra is kind of what this cue is, with orchestra and then with a bunch of other percussion. So here's bass guitar. It's a kind of a bright tone. I do have an amp and a DI. Here's the amp. Kind of honky mid-range thing. And then the DI. Actually, so it sounds like a lot of that honky sound is coming from his pickups, but blended together. The blend sounds better than the individual elements. That's why we blend DIs and amps together, or sometimes blend two different microphones on amps. That's how that works. This one, it looks like on the amp, I took out a fair amount of low mids. I think because I was getting so much low mids from the DI, I just took out a bit on the amp. Then these are now going down to a bus because I wanted to compress and EQ the bass as one element. So this is a bus before it even goes to the stem bus, which isn't even doing anything here. Yeah, I didn't do any EQ on this. It just has the tape saturation and the safety limiter. So let's turn the EQ on. So this is adding some upper mids just to get it to cut through the mix a bit more. It looks like I boosted 3 dB of 60 dB. And I didn't add any high end. Sometimes I'll jack this up to get some extra sizzle, but in this case I didn't need any of that 10K. But I love this. I should update to the new one because it does sound nice. But this is the old school Helios EQ. Even more low mids taken out. That can sound nice in a thick rock mix, but for this, since there's orchestra and everything like this, I just needed to clean up the bass a bit more. Leaving the low end, this low sort of fundamental notes here, but just taking out some of the high mids. And then my favorite bass compressors, of course, a Fairchild. Great $30,000 compressor. And yeah, I didn't compress this one much. Sometimes, again, I'll compress bass more, but this one was just sort of kissing it, not doing a ton. In the whole mix, I was adding some modulation as well. Let's take a listen to that. But yeah, bass wasn't a huge element. Really it was more about the drums and the orchestra in this section. So some of the cues, the bass is a lot louder. For this one, we just sort of had it as an extra foundation. It's kind of more of the blend instead of being out in front like it would be in some pop songs. So that's really subtle. It's down quiet. Let me put this at unity. So that's pretty, extreme. That sounds like a, Nirvana kind of thing or something. This is fat wide pads. This is pretty much the only preset I use for micro shift. It's usually where I start. I sweep this focus until it sounds as wide as possible. Put the mix at wet when I'm doing a send return kind of thing here. This one is quite detuned. Sometimes I'll turn down the detune if I don't want that much chorusing. I'll use more delay. But that's that sound. I didn't want it to sound that chorusy though. I just wanted a little extra width on the bass. So I pulled it down 15 dB. So it's just a tiny little extra. Barely a little anything, but it just adds a little width to the bass. It's just really a subtle thing to give the bass a little more size in the mix. Now, there actually aren't that many live guitars on here. This is from Andrew Sinowak. He played the bass and guitar on all of this show. So the only live guitar it looks like he did here were these. Oh, sorry, I have the folder closed. There it is. I don't usually close folders, so I'm not used to seeing them closed. I just use them as an organization. There it is. Anyway, these are the rhythm guitars. So the bass and these other guitars are all Andrew Sinowak, great guitar player. Here's the drive. Chugging guitar, rhythm guitars. Double tracked, pan left and right. If I get double track guitars, I'm going to hard panel left and right. I don't get too like, oh, I need 95 or 80 or 85. Sometimes if I have multiple double tracked guitars, I might, change the pans in and out, but most of the time I just go wide. Sounds great. Done. EQ. I love using this Neve 1081, almost a 1084, 1081 on guitars. So just kind of taking out some mid ranges to clear them up, taking out a little low end here. Looks like I filtered out just so if there's any rumble, in a mix this thick, you don't need super low end from your guitars. You've got bass, you've got percussion, you've got contrabasses in the orchestra and all that. It looks like I'm adding some 10K here too. So here's the guitars dry. So actually, quite an extreme EQ on these. That's quite a bit. I don't always EQ guitars quite this much, but in this case, to get them to pop out in the mix, I really added a lot of high end and sucked out some mid range. And then Kramer Pi is one of my favorite rhythm guitar compressors. Not doing a ton, 3 dB. Just adding some fun. And then, I typically don't want too much reverb on rhythm guitars, but I did add some of this Altiverb using this Whistle Lured Studio. It's really small, it's really tight, but it just adds a little space. Let's hear what that sounds like. Yeah, you hear how tight that is, but it just adds, again, it's kind of like how I use microshift. It's just a little width. It's just a little extra space to kind of, set the guitars back a little bit. In a thick mix like this, I like to use sort of different rooms and different modulations and kind of things to kind of put things dimensionally front to back. So not much. Sometimes I'll use more. That gives you a sense of the effect. I didn't use that much of it. I put these at -6. So that's what those sound like. Now here's what they sound like in the whole mix. See, in the whole mix, they don't sound too bright. I take that EQ off. If I don't have that EQ on there, even though isolated, it sounded like I took way too much mid-range out and jacked the high end way too much. In the mix, you can barely hear the guitars without that high end boost and the mid-range taken out. It just sort of blends, and sometimes you want that. You want them to blend in and kind of sound like, part of the soup of sound. But in this case, we wanted to hear that there were guitars going on here. Now you can hear the guitars. So here's like the band. You know, that sounds like that's a rock band. Add orchestra. That's Cobra Kai. At the beginning here, we did have some of these lead guitars going on, but just at the very beginning, and then it looks like we have a prelay guitar here going on. So here's what that sounds like. It's actually not that much of not really a lead. I just stemmed it out so that the dub had a little bit of control over this guitar, this delay guitar loop, and then this guy at the beginning here. But oftentimes guitar 1 and 2, I use it for rhythm and lead. But I didn't do anything to this actually. Usually I'll have similar things, either Kramer Pi or 1176 and a 1081. But this one I thought sounded fine. So this one, same thing. I used this whistle lured. Oh no, sorry, this one has cello. So quite a bit, but it doesn't sound like reverb, right? It just sounds like a room. It just sounds like space. And then I did add a little bit of plate. Both pretty short. The plate's, of course, a little bit longer. You know, you can hear that. It's, what, like 1.5 seconds. So that adds a little space in there, but that's what I put on that. And then we do have this delay guitar loop. Almost kind of a synth. It's pretty processed, but it is a guitar, so I put it on the guitar stem. And then the later section we're listening to shows up again. It's just sort of a little sort of ostinato underneath everything. And I did add a little room to that. Looks like I did EQ it, but then I decided to turn it off. Oh, no. I did that for you guys. So, yeah, so this is just a little thick. You know, that's a lot of low end. You can see if I turn this on, one of the best things about ProQ is having this analyzer. Of course, you should be able to EQ by ear, but when you're moving quickly and once you're pretty confident that you know your frequencies, the analyzer really can help you, especially with seeing if there's any super low end stuff to clean up. And this, you know, on its own, that sounds nice. It sounds fine. But in a mix this thick with this much stuff going on, didn't need that much low end. So I didn't totally take it out. You can see I put the center frequency of this cut sort of right over the fundamental of this sound, and then took out some extra, you know, low mids, just to clean it up. Because in the mix, this just was contributing the high sort of mid, you know, chuggy sound. But here's everything up until that point. And actually, this cue, this is everything that's going on at this moment. The rest of the tracks are all going on in different sections. So that's that cue there. That's the cue as it stands there. Now at the end and the beginning, we have a few more elements. We have this mini Moog bass going on here, which is a fun thing. Let's listen to that. Does that sound good? It already has sort of a chorus or a, you know, flanger or some sort of widening effect on it that came from Zach and Leo. So that sounded fine. But I did do a little EQ. Again, just I'm always paying attention to low mids because that can get built up really, really easily in a thick mix like this. And additionally for scores, you know, again, as we're talking about the music here, you know, we're just listening to the music. We're just listening to this cue. We have to remember that this sits against dialogue and sound effects as well. So you have to consider that, you know, you don't want to make things too obtrusive in the mids and the low mids, or else it's going to eat up dialogue and sound effect space. And what'll end up probably happening is the dub mixer will turn the music down further because it's not working as well. So you have to be really careful with your mid-range in score mixing because, yeah, you have to really make sure, especially dialogue. Dialogue is king in film and television. So you usually don't want the score to be too present in the mid-range, or else it's just going to interfere with dialogue too much. But same thing with low mids. Again, this was YouTube. Now it's Netflix. A lot of people are watching this on laptops. They're watching them on phones. They're watching them on TV with TV speakers. Not everybody has a home theater system or a sound bar, so low mids really are something you got to watch out for. I've heard plenty of scores before where there's a lot of low mid information going on, and I've watched it like in my bedroom TV with the TV speakers, and the whole TV's rattling because there's so much low mid. So I never think you should have that happening. So I'm always making sure the low mids are clear. So for this, that's all I did. The rest of it sounded fine. And it's not a lot. It's just what this was contributing to the mix. You know, leaving the low fundamentals, but just taking out a little low mid. And then again, you know, it's an ARP synth. I don't want to add a lot of, you know, overt reverb. So I just added this room. Let's see what this is. This is Hansa. This is sort of a medium room. So I already had that on there. Not doing a lot. Just a little space. Nothing crazy. So that's that. And then let's hear what that sounds like in the whole mix. Yeah, so you can hear, with the contrabasses and the cellos playing there and the low brass, you just don't want this eating up too much of the low mids, but it just adds a little motion that's going on through this section of the cue. And then we do have some great pads here going on. Scary synths is what they called them. These are actually sounds, I believe, that were used sort of as a theme for Crease. So right now what's going on in the show is Johnny and Crease are fighting. There's your spoiler. Please watch the show before you watch this. Already warned you. But yeah, Crease and Johnny are fighting in this part of the show. So these synths are sort of going back to Crease's Vietnam sort of horrors. And there's a few flashbacks in the scene to Vietnam. And these are kind of part of that sound. So I don't think I did much with these. Yeah, just filtering out, making sure there's no crazy low end. It's subtle. Just sort of cleaning up the low mids and the mids. Some of these just in the mix were just contributing a bit too much. They were just clouding up the mix a bit. And then I did add a bit of my typical, this is a pad reverb that I like to use. I started with the smooth plate mode. I guess there's no preset. I can't remember. I made this synth reverb years ago. I can't remember how I tweaked it or where I came from. But this is sort of my template. You can see I call this PM Synth Verb 1 front. Because I often use Vintage Verb in quad. I use 2 of them. So there's a front one. Let's see, is this actually just the template? It is. Okay, so I can show you the surround one, just a little more pre-delay, a little more decay. So that would, in a surround mix, be panned to the back. If I was in 7.1, I'd have 3 sets of these for the front, side speakers, and rear, and they would all be slightly different pre-delay and decay. But generally, the decay is getting bigger as you go behind you, so that you kind of get this, decay off in the distance behind you, but very subtly. But for this one, I just used the front because we're just in stereo. So it's pretty long, but it just adds a little, vibe. So that's the synths. In this section, they're just adding a little tension, a little vibe. Now, this is the fun thing to know, too. You can see this mini Moog bass, I clip gained this +8, and these synths, I clip gained -8. So I think if I remember correctly, I got a note from Zach and Leo that these synths were too loud, and the mini Moog bass wasn't quite loud enough. So a lot of times, instead of, I typically these days kind of leave my faders around unity. It's kind of what I would do on a console typically. And then just, I use the faders for sort of fine adjustments. So if I need to really change the level of something quickly, I do use clip gain quite a bit. And it looks like everything was sort of gained. Here, let's see. Let's look at just the prelays. Yeah, it looks like they were all turned up by 2 dB. So sort of the base level of this against the orchestra was having the prelays 2 dB. And then technically this is up 1, this is up 6, this is down 10. If you think relatively from all the prelays being gained up by 2 dB first when I started this mix. Anyhow. Gain structure is kind of a topic for another video. Finally, we have live choir, and we have 3 passes of it. And here's what it sounds like totally dry. Now, again, this is another room, different studio, different engineer. They did a Decatree, some wide mics, and then they just called this choir 1 to choir 1 left and right and 2 left and right. Typically, I like to label mine soprano, alto, tenor, bass, but I always pretty much assume that left to right, the spot microphones are going to be SATB. It looks like they were here. So you can see that it's just panned left to right. The spot mics here, all the room mics are hard panned, which is what I always do. Tree and outriggers and surround mics are always hard left and right with the center mic right in the middle. Again, if this is a surround mix, this would be going to the center channel, but that's how I always pan those. Now you can see this other track here is clearly a double. So we double tracked the choir and I reverse panned them. So then you get a nice sort of, like we would with the guitar, You get sopranos on both sides, basses on both sides, tenors on both sides, altos on both sides. So basically the exact same panning, just flipped the other way around. So you get this really nice wide kind of unanimous choir sound. But here's the dry choir. So, sounds good. Good performance, good singers, but very mid-rangey, very, very cloudy. Kind of sounds like this. Kind of sounds like there's almost a sheet over them or something, or a sheet over the microphones. That's typical. Choir in a room, very roomy sound. Sometimes just gets really built up. It's really more the room. But here's what I did with the EQ. So not hugely different. Just taking out a lot of mid-range here. You know, the spot mics. This upper frequency here just gets really harsh with vocals a lot. I do this on lead vocals when I'm recording and when I'm mixing close recorded vocals as well. Not usually this drastically, depending on what the recording is. So that's just on the spot mics, which aren't contributing as much. Most of this is coming from the room mics. But yeah, taking out mid-range. Not a ton. I didn't do a lot on the spot mics. On the channels EQs here. But really what if I remember correctly, yeah, we're taking out even more mid-range on the bus. Now for choir, even though there are basses in here, they don't sing low enough to get much below, 80, 70, 60 hertz. So I filter out all this low end because usually we're gaining choir up quite a bit and there's a lot of room mics. And when you're dealing with live orchestra or live choir, room mics, we're using so much of it that you really have to watch out for rumble. A lot of rooms have a lot of just low-end rumble going on. Air Studios even, which is one of the best orchestral recording studios in the world, will have low-end rumble because there's a tube line running right underneath air. So if you really jack up the gain on the room mics and there's no basses playing, sometimes you hear rumble. So constantly kind of watching out for low-end. But for choir, I just leave it there. I don't automate it because there's nothing that's going to be that low. But let's turn this EQ on. So that's starting to clear it up. Again, not a ton, not really. I mean, this is -4, which for me is a pretty deep EQ. I'll sometimes EQ way more than that, but typically not. And then finally, just a little subtle, sort of almost like a mastering EQ, happy face going on here. A little 12K just to add a little sizzle, a little definition. And then in this case for choir, I took out 1.6 instead of 0.7. For orchestra, usually I start with 0.7, but I always play with this. I import a template setting that I have for these, and then sort of just move these around depending on what I want to do. But here's that EQ on. It's just adding just it's just a little extra sizzle. So here's a pre-EQ. Quite mid-rangey, right? So, not super bright. That doesn't sound brittle or anything like that. It still has mid-range. It still has warmth, but it's clear. It's going to sit in the mix a lot better. So that's the EQ that I did on the choir. Of course, when I A/B there, I did turn off the limiter and the tape saturation, but those are quite subtle. For reverbs, you can notice I renamed these. Typically, this wild stem's used for like solo shakuhachis or solo vocals or things like that. So I had this 250 that I was using there. But for choir, I have reverbs that I typically use for film score choir, if you will. Starting with this Symphony, another one of my favorites. I do still use this for choir reverb. Great thing about Symphony that I didn't mention before is that it goes all the way up to Dolby Atmos. So it's stereo all the way up to, I think, 714 or 716. Or actually, maybe it does 914, 916. Anyway, it goes pretty high. I don't have Atmos in here just yet, but I use it all the time in 5.0 and 7.0 because you typically never use a reverb in the LFE channel. There's just no point. Anyway, this is my typical choir sound, PM Choir Hall 1, 3.8 seconds. Not crazy long, but on the longer side. I can't remember what I built this from, but this is my choir reverb. Almost sounds longer than 3.8 seconds, right? It kind of sounds like 5. But anyway, there's that one, and then I also like to use this Altiverb, Uranienborg, I think is how you say that. Uranienborg? Not sure. It's Norwegian. I am Norwegian, but I can't say that word. Anyway, this is a church in Oslo. This is a very long reverb, 8.9 seconds. Let's just hear that one. So it's funny, even though that's 8.9 seconds, it almost sounds about the same length as a symphony, doesn't it? But I like to blend these. I blend reverbs a lot for live elements, for orchestra and things like that. Then I can kind of tweak these. Usually this is sort of sometimes super long. Anyway, these together sounds like this. And that's what I'm looking for. When the choir stops, I want to hear that nice long decay, typically. But that's all the elements that make up this cue. So let's hear the full mix from the beginning. Or actually, before we listen to that, let me just make a note about these VCAs up here. So you'll notice that I didn't really have much automation going on. For this cue, I didn't really do any spot mic automation. Looks like maybe I did a little bit on the tuba here. Prelays, I didn't do any. The drums, looks like I just globally boosted here. Turn the guitars down a little bit. Not a ton of automation for this cue, actually. But most of the automation, as you can see, is happening on these groups. So for live multitracks, you can see over here I have a number of groups. So let's look at the strings, for example. I have a group for the entire orchestra, a group for all the room mics. These groups are for the sets of microphones. So the tree, this is just the 3 tree mics. And I'll set this to have all the attributes linked. So all the, inserts and sends are all linked. So when I'm EQing it, the EQ for all 3 channels links together, which is really useful. I don't have to copy and paste EQs. If I was on a console, I would just solo the left mic and kind of get a sound for that, then match all the, EQ, insert in and out, go back and forth. But the joy of mixing in a DAW is we can do linking like this. So all the groups of microphones, if I look at the violin spots or the woodwind overhead pair here, if they're a stereo pair of mics or a set of mics, then I'll link them that way so that I can EQ things all together or do whatever processing I'm going to do together. So I have all these groups. I don't always use all of them. Like, for example, I have a group of all the string spots. It's usually off, but I have it there just in case. If they say, like, hey, can we just get the string spots up a dB? I can turn that on, turn this off, go here, and then I can just trim all of the string spots, all together like that. So it's just there. Those are things that I build when I do the first cue. And I mix the first cue with live orchestra. I set up all these groups, and then they're just there. So then when I import all these settings into future cues, I might need them. But there's a lot of stuff in score mixing since we're doing so many cues that are all kind of featuring the same elements that we kind of want to have things. We want to think ahead of what we might need in the future. But anyhow, the VCAs are controlling. You can see in parentheses here the main group. So I literally am just taking the entire multi-track, and if I were to grab this fader, you can see it's recording. It's controlling the entire multi-track there. So when I do my automation, you can see that I'm just sort of riding every element as it goes through. If we go to the beginning of the cue here, choir is going to be, boosted, turned up. So as I'm going over every section, I do this all by hand. This is why I have the S3 in front of me. I do all this automation with an actual fader. You'll notice that I do a lot of mixing just with mouse and keyboard. I've done plenty of mixes just with the mouse and keyboard before, but for orchestra, it's really nice to be able to do it with a fader and just listen to the cue and sort of, just be blending elements together. So yeah, most of the automation is up here in these VCAs. So I'll just, scroll into view my controller, and then right in front of me, I have orc, the 2 brass passes and the 3 choir passes, and I can do what I want to them, or I can solo them, do whatever. But that's how I like to automate orchestra. And while we're talking about groups, you'll notice here that I also have this all VCA here. Now, if we look at this all group, you'll notice that this is literally every single source track in the entire mix. Every microphone, every prelay is all on this all group that is literally everything. And I use that because with big, thick mixes like this, sometimes I'll get all the elements together and I'll put them together because, this is how I build a mix when I'm actually mixing from scratch. I go over each element and kind of build it. I started adding it. I usually start with orchestra and build it from there. Sometimes, like if this was reverse in perspective with the rock band in front with the orchestra kind of sweetening the rock band. I might do the rock stuff first. I'd mix the drums and the bass and then the guitars and then add orchestra on top of that. But either way, I'm always building things sort of section by section after I listen to the ref and kind of get an idea of what I'm going for. But oftentimes I'll then put all those elements together after I've mixed them individually, and it's way too loud. The whole thing is compressing too much on the bus compressor for the full mix. Well, in this case, I just use a bus limiter. We'll talk about stems in a little bit. But yeah, so this all, sometimes gets too much. I already have this set up. This is part of my template. If it's too loud, let's say this was too loud. This fader is the whole mix coming back from my print rig. That's pretty loud. I mean, it's got punch. It's got, it has transients, but it's still pretty loud. If I wanted this a little bit quieter, literally just pull this down. Let's go down 4. I can adjust the whole level if I want to boost it, either way. Now, I do have to be conscious that these are the source tracks, and for the percussion and drums, for example, there is compression happening after that, and then on the brass and the strings, you saw those Pro MBs that I have in. So when I'm doing this, I do have to be conscious that I am also changing the compression a little bit, because I'm changing how much input is going into those compressors. So if I make a big change, I'm like, oh my god, this cue is way, way too loud. It's just hitting all the compressors and limiters too hard. Turn it down 3-4 dB sometimes. I do go back then and I'm like, okay, I gotta lower the thresholds probably on the compressors if I want to get that same sound. But honestly, 9 times out of 10, I get things really loud. I compress them a lot, and then I do this. I turn it down, and technically it's a little bit less compressed. And a lot of times I kind of like that. I think it sounds better. But that's where taste comes in. You just kind of have to decide for yourself what you're hearing. But always have all VCA, especially when you're mixing projects that are like, action cues like this. So all of those elements are being bussed down to these outputs that I showed you before. Those outputs are all going over DigiLink through the matrix, the box that I have, over to my print rig. So this is the print machine. And you can see here, it's a smaller monitor. It's this monitor you can see to the left of me here. You can see that I have all of the buses coming in here. These are actually the inputs from the interface, and they're going to, in this case, I'm using no bus processing. For most projects, I'll have that tape saturation plugin over here on the print rig and the safety limiter, but in this case, I did that all on the mix side. So they're literally just all coming in here. I have these buses set up because in case I do want to do any extra stem mastering here, I can do it all on this rig. So those come here, then they bus to a bus that goes over to the audio track record here. So this gets string bus here. And then all of the stems here. So you can see these are the stems are all assigned to stereo mix bus. That comes over here to stereo mix bus input. That goes to a stereo, and that hits a limiter. So this is the limiter for the whole mix. If I hit play here, I am getting some limiting on the full mix. This is typically a little bit louder than sometimes I mix a lot of cues. A lot of times, even action cues, I don't get this much. But it's getting around -3 at the most, and which is, not terrible, but it's something I'm conscious of. Now, the thing you have to remember is that this stereo full mix that I'm printing, which is literally just all the stems summed together through a limiter, the dub's never going to hear this. I don't know why that's clipped. Oh, that's clipping because I turned off processing to show you guys stuff. So all these are summing together, and then this is the, that's fat. That's kind of almost like a pop mix level, but it's still fuzzy. It still has transients. But the stems is really what they're going to use. So the dub is actually going to use these tracks, which are the stems that I broke out. Strings, brass, orc, perk. For this cue, For this cue, then it looks like there's drums, bass, guitar 1 and 2, synth 1, synth 2, and wild is the choir. So they're never going to use the stereo mix. This full stereo mix here is, in this case, since it's a full stereo mix, this is actually what went on the soundtrack. So when you guys listen to the soundtrack, which is out now on Spotify, Tidal, all those places, this is what went into the mix. This is the actual mix that went on the soundtrack. But this is also what I'll send to Zach and Leo, because when we mixed this show, even though it's pre-COVID, they were so busy working on this show, still writing cues, still doing stuff, still working on future episodes, that they never came here to my studio. Even pre-COVID, I was just uploading these stereo mixes to Dropbox, and then they would send me stuff back and forth. And you'll see in my naming convention here that X4 means mix 4. That's how I label my mix numbers. So I had 3 rounds of revisions on this cue before it was approved. So yeah, but that's, I'll literally just hit record. These are synced together with Satellite Link, which is this mix and print button you see on both rigs there. When I have the mix ready to go, I'll just record it over to there. I have a script that renames everything, and then that's it. It's done. It's printed. It's ready when the composers have approved the mix. This session here, so this is the session for the entire show. This is part of the reason why I use a second rig, is as I print cues, I'm basically building an A-B roll of the entire show. So this is all of the score music that I mixed for episode 310. And this here is the whole long fight sequence that goes on towards the end of the episode. Yeah, so let's just take a listen to this and hear what it sounds like against the ref. This is my mix. So there you have it. That is Cobra Kai 310 1M19B V1.1 Duel of the Snakes Mix 4. We have long titles and numbering systems in film and television. But yeah, hope you enjoyed seeing how I mixed this cue for Cobra Kai. Might do some other cues in the future. We'll see what the response is to this video. I am going to have more mixing tutorials in the future, focusing on specific elements or specific things I do with orchestra or how I use 2 rigs. And of course, I would like to do some surround things in the future. So subscribe to my channel if you want to see those new videos when they come out. And definitely get the soundtrack for Season 3 of Cobra Kai. It's out now on Spotify. Tidal. I think there's going to be a double disc released later this month. So yeah, check it out and support Zach and Leo so they can hire me again. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.